Oh, there's something in my chest that I can't hide. When feelings get involved, I'm terrified. 'Cause I've been here before and said goodbye. Oh, are you the one when I try to look, I wish I'd find? Oh, how can I love when I've been hurt 100 times? For you I'd give it one more try. Turn away and wrestle with my doubts. Oh, I leave them all behind, but don't know how. Bury my head deep within the crowd, but I'm reaching for your hand to pull me out. Oh, are you the one when I try to look, I wish I'd find? Oh, how can I love when I've been hurt 100 times?
All right. Hello. I was just seeing how long our chapter is, and it is god-awful long. Like 40 pages. So we'll be doing half of that tonight. So, yeah. Let me just jump straight on into it. We are starting into part 3 of The Occult A History. Part 3, Chapter 1, is Witchcraft and Lycanthropy. So, let's just dive in. All right. I've mentioned already that in occult tradition, women are regarded as evil. In numerology, the female number 2, which represents gentleness, submissiveness, sweetness, is also the devil's number. The Hindu goddess Kali, the divine mother, is also the goddess of violence and destruction. Women tend to think with their feelings and intuitions rather than with the logical faculty. A female assessment of a situation or a person is likely to be more accurate and delicate than a man's, but it lacks long-range vision. One might put it crudely by saying that women suffer from short-sightedness and men from long-sightedness. Woman cannot see what lies far away, man cannot see what is close. Thus the two are ideal complements. The association of woman with evil arises from the situation in which the female assumes the male role when a short-term logic is applied to a long-term purpose. William Blake portrays the situation in his prophecy, Europe. Los is the male god of poetry. the sun and time. His consort, Enitharmon, is inspiration, the moon, and space. But although they are the ideal man and wife in eternity, they often fail to understand the other's nature in the realms of time. Blake seems to believe that female reason, quote unquote, came to dominate Europe soon after the crucifixion and continued to do so for 1800 years until the revolutions in America and France reasserted the healthier, more impersonal masculine will. But as a result of this female domination, all the less pleasant aspects of Christianity came into being. The idea that sex is sinful, sickly schoolmarmish notions of virtue and of eternal reward in, quote, an allegorical abode where existence hath never come, end quote. Creativity and adventurousness are stifled, for the female obsession with security makes them seem dangerous. Whether this situation is evil in itself, it certainly creates evil. The revolt of men like de Sade and Crowley is the violent male reaction against this stifling female idea of goodness and the triviality and spite that are its negative aspects. According to Blake, Christianity became a negative and female religion, a kind of landlady's religion of prohibitions and thou shalt not, quote unquote. If all this is true, if Blake and the occult tradition are correct in their view of women, the result is a completely new insight into witchcraft. Why do we always think of witches as women? The word applies to both men and women, but the idea of a man with magic powers conjures up a picture of a wizard or warlock, someone like Merlin or Tolkien's Gandalf, or perhaps Leighton's serpentine magician. The word witch arouses visions of women on broomsticks, stirring cauldrons with toads and henbane, or offering obscene homage to the devil. Why this association of ideas? At this present point in human history, evolution is aiming at Faculty X. Human beings are partly animal, and we are tied down to the present moment like cows. But we also have a remarkable capacity that is not possessed by any other animal. Consider that passage in Dickens's Christmas Carol, where Scrooge thinks about himself as a schoolboy remaining behind in the schoolroom and reading the Arabian Nights, with its visions of far cities and sultans' palaces, Ali Baba and Sinbad. In such a moment he realizes how far his own life has gone wrong. The human mind was meant to take wings and escape the mere present moment, soar away to other times and places. If intelligent and vital people are denied this holiday from everyday triviality, their creativity takes the form of an increasingly burning resentment against the life that imprisons them and against its moral standards. But it is not only the human imagination that craves release. The human will needs aims and desires to stimulate it. The result can be seen in the famous case of Isabel Gaudi, the Alderney witch, who suddenly decided to confess in 1662 and created a legend that retained its powers for centuries. She seems to have been an attractive, red-headed girl who married a Scottish farmer, whose remote farm was near Alderney in Morayshire, or Morayshire, if you prefer. Life on the farm was dull, and she remained childless. Her husband was an unimaginative bore. Isabel claims that she met a quote-unquote man in gray on the downs and that he baptized her as a witch that same evening in Alderney Church. This was in 1647. She went on to describe witches' Sabbaths with covens of 13 witches and her power to transform herself into a hare or cat. Significantly, her confessions are obviously sexual. She had intercourse with demons at the Sabbaths and with the devil himself. She even had intercourse with one of her demon lovers while lying in bed beside her sleeping husband. The sperm of these demons, she said, was icy cold. The devil used to beat the witches, who were of course naked. The picture that emerges is of an imaginative and highly sexed girl being driven half insane with frustration until she evolves a whole fantasy about the powers of evil. It is a basically masochistic fantasy in which she is baptized in her own blood, sucked from her by the devil, and then is beaten and sexually possessed by demons. Eventually, her whole life is dominated by this fantasy, which is reinforced by her strong masochistic tendencies. Her sexual perversion develops into it until it becomes a kind of sweet poison, made all the more potent by the rigid Presbyterianism, the Calvinistic Bible thumping that dominates the community. She can have no doubt that she has sold herself to the devil, for the fantasies that possess her day and night are diabolic. The devil swishing his scourge through the air and violating her with his immense scaly penis, which produces pangs as excruciating as childbirth, yet at the same time indescribably pleasurable. After 15 years of this, she is suddenly seized by a terrifying and almost unthinkable idea. It's like the urge that drives some men to expose themselves to children, or that made Peter Curtin go back to the scene of his sadistic murders to savor the horror of the crowd. Why not make her fantasy public? Shatter everybody by telling them what has been going on in their solid Sabbatarian community. The idea appeals to her masochism, and why not involve other people in the community? Not, of course, out of spite, but merely because this would make it altogether more convincing. She confesses. The fantasies pour out of her in the 6 weeks between April 13 and May 27, 1662, and she gloats as she sees the shock they produce. They strip her and examine her minutely for devil's marks, and she finds it all deliciously voluptuous. It's not clear what happened to her or to the other Alderan witches she implicated. One authority says she was burned and her ashes scattered. Another declares that the records are incomplete and that she may even have been released eventually. Probably she was executed. The case is remarkable chiefly for its detail, that is, for the fertility of Isabel Gaudi's imagination. But this is not to assert that all witchcraft from the 13th to the 18th centuries can be reduced to terms of imagination and sexual frustration. We know that a large percentage of people have occult powers and always have had. These range from the ability to read character to the ability to cause supernatural happenings. Such powers are more common among simple country people than people in towns. We also know that when the will and imagination are gripped with some strong idea, reality often seems to conform to it. Oh, where are my captions? I just noticed they're not there. I'm sorry. Bear with me. I know they're active over here. Well, crap. Let me fix them real quick. Sorry about that. There we go. This should fix it. There we go. Now we can get back to it. I must have fixed them on the gaming screen, but not on that one. Let's see. Okay. We also know that when the will and imagination are gripped with some strong idea, reality often seems to conform to it. There is no need to doubt Crowley's story about the dictation of the Book of the Law. It is equally certain that it was not the god Ra-Hur-Kuit who contacted Crowley's wife and finally dictated the book to Crowley. Crowley's belief in magic was a deeply emotional obsession, the channel through which springs of creativity found their way to the surface. There are plenty of parallel stories of quote-unquote inspiration, from prophecies of Nostradamus to those of Joanna Southcott at the end of the 18th century. Joanna Southcott's reputation as an inspired prophetess ended in 1814 when she announced to the world that she was about to bear Shiloh, the Prince of Peace, in a virgin birth, and actually showed every sign of pregnancy except a baby. Strindberg's autobiography Inferno reveals the way that an obsessional conviction about supernatural powers seems to cause events that confirm the reality of the powers. According to William Blake, a firm persuasion that a thing is so makes it so. Once the imaginative pattern has been set and has stirred the creative obsessions, the rest follows. It is worth noting that most of the male magicians we have considered in this book have been, on the whole, benevolent. Agrippa di Cagliostro, Saint Germain, even Crowley asserted that his magic was strictly white, and there are no stories of his harming anyone through magic. When Powes discovered that he was harming people with his psychic blasts of anger, he became neurotically benevolent. Women, on the other hand, are more prone to personal obsession, and in the case of natural witches, quote-unquote, to the misuse of their power, not for personal advantage, but for the disadvantage of their enemies. All this suggests a theory of witchcraft that differs fundamentally from the two hypotheses that have so far held the field. The first, represented by the Reverend Montague Summers, holds that the devil and his hordes of demons are real and that witches are genuinely in their power. The second, to be found in Russell Hope Robbins's Encyclopedia of Witchcraft, holds the whole thing to be a delusion. The view I am here suggesting is that witches and their powers are real enough. The devil and his powers are not. Montague Summers, that dubious and romantic clergyman, is not entirely wrong when he says that most witches deserved what they got. This is not to say that they deserve to be tortured and burned. No one does. But many of them may have believed themselves to be servants of the devil. It is significant that all the magic described by Isabel Gaudy is inspired by malice. The witches dug up the body of an unchristened child and buried it in a farmer's manure heap to destroy his crops, stuck pins in a clay image to destroy the local laird's children, plowed a piece of land with a miniature plow drawn by toads to make it sterile. Whether or not Isabel Gaudy really took part in such magical exercises is a matter for argument, but there can be no doubt that many witches did. And in many cases, perhaps the majority, their spells must have been effective. There is another aspect that must be taken into account. In small, lonely communities, superstition itself can create a kind of magical ether that may increase the effectiveness of the spells. This can be seen in a case of our own century, the witchcraft murder of Charles Walton in February 1945 at Lower Quinton, Warwickshire. Walton, a 74-year-old laborer, was found under a willow tree lying on his back with a pitchfork driven through his throat and into the ground. A cross had been slashed on his ribs, starting at the throat, and the billhook that had been used was still lodged between his ribs. Fabian of the yard, who was sent to Lower Quinton, at first had every reason to suppose it an open and shut case, since if Walton had enemies, everyone in the district would know about it. Fabian's team took 4,000 statements and sent 29 samples of clothing, hair, and blood to the police laboratories for analysis, but all to no effect. People were tense and unhelpful. They waited a whole day to question a man who peered out of his door and remarked, quote, "He's been dead and buried a month now. What are you worried about?" End quote. Then shut the door firmly. The inference seems fairly clear. Many people in the area know about the murder and are not telling. Lower Quinton is in the middle of witchcraft country. 2 miles away, on a high ridge, stand the Rollright Stones, a monument probably as old as Stonehenge and undoubtedly the site of witches' sabbaths in the past. It is a country of wooded hills, winding roads, limestone cottages, and sinister names. The Devil's Elbow, Upper and Lower Slaughter, Meon Hill itself, in whose shadow the murder occurred, has a sinister reputation for witchcraft. Donald McCormick, who wrote a book on the case, recounts a conversation in the local pub in which one of the locals stated that he knew of 2 witches still living in the area, while another claimed that he had married a witch who later left him. The dead man himself had had a reputation for second sight. As a boy, he had seen a black dog for 3 nights on Meon Hill. On the 3rd night it had changed into a headless woman, and the following day his sister had died. He bred large toads, and there were many of them in his garden when he died. Fabian himself saw a black dog running down Meon Hill, followed closely by a farmhand. But when he asked the farmhand about the dog, which had run out of sight, he went pale and asked, "What dog?" That afternoon the police car ran over a dog. The next day a heifer died in a ditch, the second since Fabian's arrival. The murder of Charles Walton is still unsolved, but it is possible to make an informed guess as to what happened. Walton was believed to be a witch, and his solitary habits increased the impression. He bred toads, an odd occupation, and a local inhabitant told Donald McCormick that he sometimes harnessed the toads to a toy plow and allowed them to run in fields. Isabel Gowdy claimed to have used the same method to cause poor crops. The farmers certainly had poor crops the previous year. Many of them complained to Fabian about it. It was 1945, the last year of the war, and for the past 5 years, South Warwickshire had been exceptionally isolated. No foreign visitors to Stratford or Evesham. Low-gravity beer in the pubs, and not much of that. In 1944, there was a bad harvest. 1945 began warm and wet, but somebody believed that Charles Walton and his toads would ensure another bad harvest. Southern Warwickshire has its own traditional methods of dealing with witches. There is a belief that if a witch is made to bleed, her power is neutralized. In 1643, parliamentary forces saw an old woman walking on the river at Newbury and shot her after slashing her forehead to drain her of her power. Robbins suggests she was walking on stilts. In 1875, 70 years before the murder of Charles Walton, a village idiot named John Haywood became convinced that an old woman named Ann Turner, or Tennant, had bewitched him. He pinned her to the ground with a hay fork and slashed her throat and chest in the form of a cross with a billhook. This was only 2 miles away from Lower Quinton in Long Compton. That Walton was a witch is doubtful. That locals believed he was is almost certain. To understand the murder and how presumably decent people could condone it, one has to make an effort of imagination and carry the mind back to the warm January and February of 1945 in an out-of-the-way village suffering the effects of 5 years of war. Walton was killed on February 14th, which was not only St. Valentine's Day and Ash Wednesday, but the day on which the ancient Druids made their sacrifices. The Druidic date was February 1st, but their calendar was 2 weeks behind ours. The sacrifice was for ensuring good crops. Walton's murder was probably planned months in advance, perhaps the previous autumn, and the date fixed. It seems fairly certain that it was believed that his familiar was a black dog, for a black dog was found hanged on Meon Hill a few days after the murder, and if anyone experienced remorse about the killing of a harmless old laborer, it probably vanished as the year advanced and the harvest was bad, in spite of the good weather. McCormick quotes one old countryman, quote, Crops should have been the best ever with early spring. There's no reason for bad crops. Summit's wrong when crops go against nature." End quote. The Lower Quinton case is not particularly interesting for its own sake, but it enables us to understand something about witchcraft in Europe. For the quote-unquote European witch craze, as Professor Trevor Roper calls it, is a baffling phenomena that has never been satisfactorily explained. The Middle Ages did not believe in witches. The official church doctrine expressed in the Canon Episcopi stated that anyone who believed in witches, quote, "is beyond doubt an infidel and a pagan," end quote. The change in attitude began in the 11th century with the rise of a powerful sect called the Cathars. Doctrinally speaking, the Cathars were descendants of the Gnostics and Manichees, whom we have discussed in an earlier chapter. They believed that the Old Testament God was a demon, that the world was the creation of the devil, the monster of chaos. They accepted that salvation could be obtained through Jesus, but apparently insisted that Jesus had not actually been crucified on the cross. His earthly form was a phantom, for how could the essence of goodness be embodied in matter, which is evil by nature? Like the Manichees and the later Russian sect called the Skoptsi, the Cathars believed in sexual abstention, on the grounds that anything that prolongs physical existence is evil. The amazing thing is that Catharism gained such immense and widespread acceptance. Originating apparently in the Balkans in the 10th century, they spread slowly over Europe. A sect of Cathars near the town of Albi in southern France became known as Albigensis. In various forms, this new Gnosticism spread as far as Constantinople, where they were known as Bogomils. In the east to northern France, where the first Cathar bishop was established in 1149. By the end of the 12th century, there were 11 Cathar bishops, 6 of them in Italy itself. No doubt the misery and disease of the late Middle Ages helps to account for this success. Prosperous countries are content with an easygoing religion. Where there is poverty and misery, something sterner and darker is required. This is why Presbyterianism later made such an appeal in Scotland, and why Methodism flourished among the bleak and rainy villages of Cornwall. There is also something in the Manichean doctrine that appeals to the deep romanticism in human nature, the feeling that this world is hell and that man's happiness lies in another sphere. How's it going? Everything's going good. Okay. When Count Raymond the Sixth of Toulouse became a Cathar, the Pope decided it was time to do something about it and called for a crusade. To many knights and barons of France, this was like being asked to a boar hunt. It would only last 40 days, the standard specified time for a crusade, and there was sure to be plenty of rape and plunder. A vast army swept down on southern France, and whole towns were wiped out, heretics and faithful alike. Simon de Montfort, father of the de Montfort who formed the first English Parliament, was the most brutal of these plunderers, and stayed on in Toulouse, causing a bloody war. The infamous Inquisition was born in Toulouse in 1229, and its most determined agents were Dominicans, who traveled around and reported heresy wherever they found it. The full story of the horrors of these years has never been told, and perhaps this is just as well. The Church was determined to stamp out this heresy at all costs. A cynic might take the view that cardinals dining on roast boar and good Italian wine felt threatened by the bleakly ascetic doctrine of the Cathars. At all events, the Cathars and the Albigenses were bloodily stamped out. The few survivors withdrew to remote mountain villages, as did the Waldenses under similar persecution more than 2 centuries later. Dominic, later Saint Dominic, founder of the Friar Preachers, who established his headquarters at Toulouse in 1215, vowed to dedicate himself to destroying Catharism by, quote, persuasion addressed to the heart and mind, end quote. But his secret police, for this in effect is what the Dominicans were, soon got the bit between their teeth and saw devil worshippers in every shadow. It was these Dominican preachers who discovered that the devil had changed his tactics. Having lost his army of Cathars, he set out to create a secret army of evil old women dedicated to his service and to the secret overthrow of the church. Possibly they were not entirely wrong. Extreme cruelty and persecution is bound to produce an underground dedicated to destroying the oppressors through secret means, and so we must think of the earliest witches as a Cathar resistance movement, a kind of heretical IRA. This is not as absurd as it sounds. It is true that there had always been witches in small numbers, but they were, so to speak, private practitioners. The Cathars believed that the God who created this world is a demon who had managed somehow to wrest his power from the ultimate Godhead, which is far above such trivialities as creation. This is a comfortless doctrine. To whom are you to pray when in extreme distress? Not to the Supreme Being. Why would he care what one of his fallen eons had been up to? That leaves the wicked eon himself, the master of chaos, old Nobodaddy. Perhaps some of the Cathar women who had seen their husbands and children murdered did pray to the monster of chaos for revenge. 2 centuries later, the Cathars no longer existed, but the Dominican inquisitors were fulminating against witches, whom they called Waldenses, who met together at Sabbaths or Valdesia. The Waldenses were also called Vaudois, after the Alpine village of Piedmont, where they established themselves. In the Pyrenees, witches were called Ganzaria, obviously derived from Cathars. Gazaria. The Dominicans kept asking the church to give its official sanction to the crusade against witches, but the church, remembering that the canon episcopi denied the existence of witches, held out for another century. Then, unfortunately, a superstitious paranoiac, John the 22nd, became pope. He was convinced that his enemies were plotting to kill him by magic, so it was he who finally gave way to the Dominican demand that sorcery itself should become a crime, quite apart from the question of heresy. This was in 1326, in Super Ilias Specula. It is significant that this same pope had declared heretical the Franciscan doctrine of the poverty of Christ. Anything to do with poverty was suspect. Even so, the witchcraft epidemic began slowly. It started in the Pyrenees and the Alps, the territory of the Albigenses and the Waldenses. The pattern emerged very early. In the first secular trial for witchcraft in Paris in 1390, a woman called Jeanne de Brigue was accused of sorcery by a man she had cured when on the point of death. Jeanne explained that she was not a witch, but that she had simply used charms taught to her by another woman, which included, quote, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, end quote, from which it is clear that the fundamentals of charming have not changed in 600 years. Under threats of torture, confined in an icy and filthy dungeon over the winter months of 1390 and 91, Jeanne finally confessed to having a demonic familiar named Hazebut. Ruili, the man she had cured, told the court that Jeanne attributed his illness to bewitchment by his mistress, by whom he had 2 children. Under threat of torture, Jeanne confessed that it was actually she who had bewitched Ruili, at the request of Ruili's wife, Masette. who wanted to pursue a love affair with the local curate. Masset was then also arrested, tortured on the rack, and confessed. It is not explained why Jehane bewitched Ruili and then saved him. Jehane and Masset were executed. There were undoubtedly many cases in which white witchcraft, the natural application of occult powers, led to torture and execution. In 1618, a vagabond named John Stuart had a vision of a ship sinking near Padstow in Cornwall. He was in Irvine, in Scotland at the time. When the news came that a ship from that area had sunk at Padstow, Stuart was arrested and charged with second sight. A woman who had muttered curses about someone on board the ship was arrested as a witch, and under torture she implicated 2 other women and the 8-year-old daughter of one of them. The child confessed that she had seen a demon dog that emitted light while her mother and Margaret Barclay, the accused witch, molded wax figures. Margaret Barclay was strangled and burned, although she withdrew the confession that had been forced from her under torture. One woman who she accused died after a fall from the church roof. She was escaping from the belfry. Another confessed, quote unquote, confessed, but withdrew her confession and declined to forgive the executioner at the end. John Stuart managed to strangle himself with his own bonnet ribbon while awaiting execution. After the publication of the Malleus Maleficarum, already referred to on page 267 in 1486, the new science of printing played its important part in the expansion of the witch craze. Any writer with a vivid imagination could reckon on achieving a degree of celebrity with a description of the demons evoked by witches. Professor Trevor Roper points out that the majority of these demonologists, quote unquote, who caused such incalculable suffering, were harmless scholarly characters. Remy was a Latin poet and a historian, yet when he died in 1616, he had sent nearly 3,000 victims to the stake. Boguet and de Lancret are both mild scholars and Latinists. The witch craze was so horrible and so widespread that the human imagination cannot encompass it. We find it hard enough to envisage Hitler's murder of 6 million Jews over less than 10 years, so it is quite impossible to imagine a campaign of torture and murder lasting for 4 centuries. It is true that witchcraft executions were on a smaller scale than the Nazis' atrocities, but it must also be remembered that each witch was tortured individually. Rossell Hope Robbins seethes with a moral indignation. Quote, "The record of witchcraft is horrible and brutal. Degradation stifled decency, the filthiest passions masqueraded under the cover of religion, and man's intellect was subverted to condone bestialities that even Swift's yahoos would blush to commit. Never were so many so wrong so long," end quote. But after reading a dozen or so pages of his Encyclopedia of Witchcraft, the student feels that these words err on the side of mildness. For atrocities on this scale, there can be no single cause. It was partly political. Countries came first under Protestant, then Catholic domination, and when the Church wanted to punish a Protestant populace, it sent Dominican inquisitors. Catholic reconquest caused witch purges in the Rhineland, Flanders, Poland, Hungary. It was the Church's way of taking revenge on Protestants. It could also be used by a prince or baron as a method of taking revenge on rebellious subjects, a safe way that would not lead to further rebellion. Hey, Nambro! Narcissist cults often end up violent due to guilt, shame, rage complex which is projected upon their abuse victims. Any and all can become a Smith until they break free from the Matrix permanently, like Neo. Whether Puritan or Catholic or Communist or Nazi, it's all the same. Okay. I really don't have anything to add to that, so I'll just continue on. Thank you for coming in. I don't. I just don't have anything to add to that. It was the church's way of taking revenge on Protestants. It could also be used by a prince or baron as a method of taking revenge on rebellious subjects, a safe way that would not lead to further rebellion. I know I already read that. But the psychological motivations are equally important. The beginning of the witchcraft craze corresponded with the Black Death and the 100 Years' War. When people are oppressed and miserable, violence becomes a psychological necessity. And violence is always associated with sex, particularly in puritanical and repressive societies. Witches were made to confess to intercourse with demons and minutely examined for the witch's mark, a spot on the body insensitive to pain. Franz Biermann, appointed witch seeker by the Prince Archbishop of Cologne in the 1630s, apparently used his position to seduce women who would otherwise be inaccessible. A Frau Peller who refused his advances was the wife of a court assessor. Biermann acted swiftly. She was arrested one morning and was under torture by the afternoon. The hairs were all shaved off her body and head, and the torturer's assistant was allowed to rape her while he did this. Biermann, looking on, stuffed a dirty piece of rag into her mouth to stifle her cries. She was burned alive in a hut filled with dry straw, all within hours. Biermann had been placed in a position where he could act out sexual, sadistic fantasies. It sounds like an episode from a novel by de Sade. Yeah, what a piece of shit. With all the talk of demons, witches' sabbaths, torture, the smell of burning flesh, witchcraft became a darkly alluring obsession. Its equivalent nowadays would be the particularly violent sex crime, which is nearly always followed A, by imitative crimes, B, by confessions from cranks. The murder of Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia, in Hollywood in 1949 was followed by 6 similar murders in the Los Angeles area and 29 confessions to the crime. The particularly horrible nature of the murder, she had been hung upside down, tortured, then cut in half, had made it front-page news for weeks. Lonely men brooding on the newspapers in stuffy lodgings finally decided that it would be worth the risk, and in the same way lonely, bored women like Isabel Gowdy, living narrow and comfortless lives, found the lurid pamphlets about intercourse with demons terrifying and increasingly fascinating. And since they believed that the air is full of invisible demons, it would not be long before they were convinced that their wishes were known to the devil. A sexual dream would confirm this. But they did all this. But why did all this happen after the Reformation? The Middle Ages may have been the ages of faith, but they were also ages of war, poverty, disease, and belief in demons. All the conditions were there, except one, the peculiarly human condition of freedom of imagination. In the Middle Ages, this had not yet evolved. Man plodded about his daily tasks and did not see far beyond them. What happened after 1450 was not only a social, but an evolutionary change. One of those periodic ripples that seem to run across the human race like wind across corn. Guy de Rais, a baffling figure, signals its arrival in the first half of the century. His spirit wants to burst its prison, to commit crimes that no man has ever dared to commit, to establish contact with the devil himself, to become the wealthiest and most powerful prince in Christendom. The peasants whose children he stole were patient, plodding, cow-like creatures who finally forgave the torturer. But during the next century, the unrest that drove Guy to demonism reached the peasantry and was amplified by their boredom. Why, asked Dr. Margaret Murray, are the accounts of the witches' Sabbaths so remarkably similar, whether they come from France in the 14th century, or Austria in the 15th, or Spain in the 16th, or the Netherlands in the 17th. Why is the devil always described as a huge goat-like man, or less frequently as a huge toad, who speaks with a hoarse voice, quote, like someone speaking through a bunghole, end quote, who makes the witches kiss his nauseating behind, and whose embraces are icy cold? It must be more than mere imagination, or some of the stories would vary, making the devil hot, or sweet-smelling, or pleasant-voiced. Montague Summers takes this to be evidence for the reality of the devil. Dr. Murray does not go as far as that. She only suggests that the Sabbaths were a reality, and that the devil was probably impersonated by an enormous man wearing a mask and a cloak, and who used an artificial phallus that squirted cold milk. She certainly has no doubts that such Sabbaths took place, and neither have even the most skeptical historians. What happened then, it seems, is that the witch craze produced a hysteria that created precisely what it was trying to destroy. This is a peculiarity of the human imagination that is only now being recognized by psychology. That when it is denied active creative expression, it seeks out any powerful stimulus, no matter how terrifying or negative. The human mind craves movement, any movement. Sartre describes in one of his early books the case of a young girl who had been educated in a convent and then married to a professional man. Left alone all day in the apartment, she began to experience an absurd compulsion to go to the window and summon men like a prostitute. Goethe has a classic story called The Honest Attorney. Honest attorney, wow, okay, in which a virtuous young wife, left to herself, finally becomes insanely obsessed with the idea of committing adultery, precisely because the idea would normally horrify her. What is at work here is the same principle as in hypnotism. Boredom or emptiness allows the mind to fill up with unused energy, producing a painful sensation like an over-full bladder. An excessive degree of self-consciousness is created. This produces the usual effect of preventing the instincts from doing their quiet, unobtrusive work. The feelings are frozen. The desire for strong feelings, the most basic of human psychological needs, becomes a kind of panic. Guilt and misery are preferable to boredom. What the mind really craves is a sense of vastness and wide openness, of other times and other places, of meaning. What the inquisitors were doing was to create a body of myths and symbols that were supercharged with meaning, and that consequently exercised an overwhelming gravitational pull on imaginative and bored women. The devil literally finds work for idle hands and idle minds. That whole passage it's so relevant to what's going on in the world today, and especially in this country. I mean, I can't say for sure how bad it is in Europe as far as all this everybody's queer or gay or gender fluid or whatever, and it's so much the imagination of these people. That's why every other day they're coming out with more pronouns, and why they've obsessed on pronouns, I just cannot. I've never been able to wrap my head around, other than the fact that every other generation before them didn't give a flying buck-toothed fuck about pronouns. And it's sort of that rebelling against the parents thing. You don't care about pronouns, so they're going to be ultimately important to me. But it also just seems like it's a easy outlet for their imaginations to just run wild. And anyway, I digress. Getting back to it. I would regard this as the most important element in the witch craze. More important than ecclesiastical politics, or even the persecution of harmless natural mediums and clairvoyants. And if this is so, then it must also be recognized that the inquisitors and judges were not as blameworthy as we now believe. They knew little or nothing about the symptoms of sexual hysteria, and the symptoms of demonic possession were often very convincing indeed, as we have seen in the case of the Loudun nuns. Let a modern liberal rationalist try to put himself in the position of some ordinary parish priest of the 17th century, reading a pamphlet describing the possession of a girl called Elizabeth Allier. When the nun, who is 27, goes into fits that any modern psychologist would recognize as sexual hysteria, and speaks in a hoarse masculine voice, the Dominican friar Francois Farconnet repeats exorcisms and questions the demons. They give their names as Orjul and Boniface, and explain that they entered the girl on a crust of bread when she was 7 and intend to stay there until she dies. The incantations continue over Saturday and Sunday, and finally, when the friar exposes the sacrament and orders, quote, "Go then, miserable creatures," end quote, the girl twists into extreme convulsions, her tongue sticks several inches out of her mouth, and the devils declare hoarsely, quote, "I go, Jesus," end quote. From then on, we assume, the girl is cured. No one is hurt, no one is tortured or burnt. It is just a case of holy friar freeing a poor girl from 2 evil spirits. Would even the most skeptical parish priest be justified in doubting that demons really do exist, and that he should warn his congregation solemnly about the importance of saying grace before meals and making the sign of the cross over anything you happen to eat between meals? Moreover, although it is true that many witch confessions are produced by torture, many of them are voluntary, by women who know that their only chance of saving their souls from eternal punishment is to allow their bodies to be committed to the flames. Wow. Yeah. Okay, and I think I'm just about, let's see, we started on, oh no, I got a ways to go. I'm only going to do half the chapter tonight, but we got a ways to go. It is true that there are skeptics like Johann Weyer, the pupil of Cornelius Agrippa, Reginald Scott, Friedrich von Spee, himself a witch judge, who changed his mind about witches. But how can one take such people seriously? They assert that witches do not exist, that accounts of spells and second sight are old wives' tales, when everyone in the parish knows that the grocer's wife dreamt of her father's death the very night it happened, and that horses shy up at a spot where 2 witches were buried in unhallowed ground. This kind of skepticism is really an incapacity for religious feeling. It would be capable of dismissing the virgin birth itself as superstition. And of course, such reasoning is fundamentally correct. But the evidence for demons and witches' Sabbaths was of a kind that no reasonable, unbiased mind could reject. Some witches undoubtedly could blast crops with their curses. Thousands of old women could foretell the future and charm warts. What the inquisitors, the sincere and religious ones, failed to see was that all this is no reason for torture and burning, that in fact the torture and burning have the effect of increasing the grip of the devil on the human imagination. We must also take into account the stimulus of torture and burning on the human imagination. Man has not been civilized for long, a few thousand years. Christianity does not come naturally to the strong and enterprising. Prosperous merchants and stolid farmers long for peace and a quiet routine, but the born soldier dreams of winning glory in battle. and the born criminal dreams of burning cities and raping the women. It is significant that the really violent manifestations of the witch craze date from the end of the Hundred Years' War, 1453, almost as if it were a substitute for war, and they come to an end in the latter part of the 18th century, just before the new era of wars and revolutions plunges Europe into mass bloodshed again. The witch craze rolled over Europe in a series of waves, each one followed by a period of calm. There were times when the persecutions became so bloody that there was a spontaneous revolt against them. By the beginning of the 16th century, the craze was reaching a climax, particularly in Germany, where its most sadistic manifestations seemed to occur. Why is Germany always at the center of all the bad shit in Europe? If the appointed inquisitors showed themselves too tolerant, they were likely to be burned as witches. This happened to Dietrich Flade, or I'm just going to say Flade, who was the vice governor of Treves and rector of the university. He exerted his influence to restrain witch hunters and did his best to get condemned witches banished instead of burned. His leniency opened him to the suspicions of being on the devil's payroll, and a witch hunter named Zant literally framed him by bribing condemned witches to shout that Flade was a witch himself. In exchange for this, they were strangled before being burned. In spite of his eminent position, Flade was arrested and finally strangled and burned. In Bamberg in 1628, Vice-Chancellor George Hahn was similarly accused of being too lenient with witches, and he and his wife and daughter were all burned, in spite of an order from the emperor himself for their release. In the case of Hahn, this might be considered poetic justice, for he had been one of the accusers of the burgomaster Johann Eunice, whose last letter to his daughter before his execution is one of the most moving documents in the history of witchcraft. Quote, "And then came also God in highest heaven have mercy, the executioner, and put the thumbscrews on me, both hands bound together, so that the blood spurted from the nails and everywhere, so that for 4 weeks I could not use my hands, as you can see from my writing. Thereafter they stripped me, bound my hands behind me, and drew up on the ladder. Then I thought heaven and earth were at an end. 8 times did they draw me up and let me fall again, so that I suffered terrible agony. I said to Dr. Braun, 'God forgive you for this misusing an innocent, for thus misusing an innocent.' He replied, 'You are a knave. Now, my dearest child, you have all my acts and confessions, for which I must die, and it is all sheer lies and inventions, so help me God. If God send no means of bringing the truth to light, our whole kindred will be burned." End quote. Other eminent citizens were tried and executed, their property valued at 220,000 florins. Went to the bishop prince, Gottfried Johann von Dorheim. His cousin, Bishop of Würzburg, burned 900 witches between 1623 and 1631. Tortures included crushing by heavy weights, the latter a form of strappado, dislocating the arms from their sockets, baths in boiling water, which killed 6 people in 1630, forcible feeding on herring cooked in salt, and then refusal of water, needles driven into the quick of the nails up to their heads, and perhaps most effective for procuring confessions, prevention of sleep for days or weeks. Punishments included the cutting off of hands and the tearing off of female breasts with red-hot pincers. Eventually, the Emperor Ferdinand himself was forced to intervene and order that the trials be made public and the confiscation of property stopped. The bishop died in 1632. His cousin had died the previous year. Many of these epidemics of sadism ceased only when the investigator died a natural death. The prince bishops of Würzburg and Bamberg were brutal sadists. Other notable witch hunters have been callous rogues. England's most infamous figure, Matthew Hopkins, the quote-unquote rich witch finder general, claimed to have, quote, the devil's list of all the witches in 17th century England, end quote, when in fact he had only read 2 books on demonology. Like Senator Joe McCarthy, he set up a committee and was soon traveling from end to end of England to examine witches, charging large sums of money for his services. He was an unsuccessful lawyer who became a highly successful prosecutor for 14 months. He declared that the sign of a witch is that she has a familiar, a demon in the form of an animal, and the deposition against his first victim, Elizabeth Clark of Manningtree, Essex, included his sworn statement that he had seen 4 imps in the form of a dog, a polecat, a greyhound, and a black demon with her. His assistants also swore to having seen them. His methods of extorting confessions were less horrible than those of the German witch-finders, but equally effective. He threw trussed-up women into duck ponds to see if they sank, forced victims to sit cross-legged on a low stool until they confessed. He also made them walk continuously until their feet blistered. This form of torture demanded relays of walkers. A 70-year-old parson, John Lowes, of Bury St. Edmunds, was kept awake for several nights and run backwards and forwards across the room at top speed until he confessed to all the accusations. He retracted the confession later, but was hanged all the same. The Civil War was still raging, and the tension found outlet in these witch trials. When a dozen people had been condemned and hanged, everyone had an illusory feeling that everything would be better from now on. There were mass trials, and in 1645 19 people were condemned and hanged at Chelmsford. 4 of the 32 accused had already died in prison, and several others went back there for a long time. At Bury St. Edmunds, 18 were hanged. Hopkins was responsible for 68 executions in Suffolk alone during 1645, but by the following year, moderation had begun to assert itself. A Huntingdon clergyman, John Gall, preached against him when he heard that Hopkins intended to begin a witch hunt there. Hopkins blustered and threatened, but his authority collapsed as quickly as it had been established. He retired to his home in Manningtree and died of tuberculosis later in the same year. He had been responsible for some hundreds of deaths in 14 months. The repeal of the Witchcraft Act in 1736, so that the punishment ceased to be death, put an end to the witchcraft craze in England, although witches continued to be swum for 50 years or more after it was repealed. To read straight through a large number of accounts of witch trials, as I did before writing this chapter, is to begin to feel slightly insane. The accounts of tortures lead one to wonder whether human beings are ultimately redeemable. For every saint, the human race has apparently produced 100 murderers capable of the last degree of viciousness, and the sheer absurdities to which so many of the accused confessed added a discordant note of farce to the tragedy. Yeah, I was going to say, for every saint, 100 murderers. Just about every one of those inquisitors was one of those hundreds of murderers. But anyway. Yet oddly enough, the final impression is one of pity, a pity that embraces the accusers and accused. The human mind was never intended for narrowness, and when it is trapped, it becomes trivial and vicious. The real tragedy of Suffolk in 1645 is not that Matthew Hopkins hanged 100 or so innocent people, but that human beings in general were so demoralized and devitalized that they would accept it. Village communities had become stagnant pools that bred pestilence. Well, that would be because of the church, in large part. And its complete iron-fisted control over everything, every bit of science and medicine and everything. Again, I digress. This is difficult for us to understand in the age of big cities and mass communication. We cannot imagine that kind of stagnation, in which the human mind had no escape from itself except through malicious gossip about the neighbors. Oh, this guy didn't know anything about social media back in 71. Toward the end of the 18th century, all this began to change. The dividing line between the world of the past and our own world was an event that occurred in the year 1740. The publication of a novel called Pamela. The statement sounds absurd, but consider it more closely. Before Richardson wrote Pamela, the chief form of escapist entertainment that issued from the printers was the pamphlet, usually with a title like A True Narration of the Horrible Crime Committed at York by So-and-so. The novels of Defoe, issued a quarter of a century before Richardson began to write, are enlarged pamphlets containing true narrations, quote unquote. Pamela is a novel told in letters. A description of a virtuous girl's resistance to her would-be seducer, and it is very long. Its reader could enter the world of another person's life and stay there for days on end. If we imagine Jane Austen or the Bronte sisters being brought up in a country vicarage in the year 1700, we can immediately grasp the import of what has happened. No doubt Jane Austen would still have read Homer and Dante and Shakespeare and become a literate and articulate young lady, but it would not have been the same. The classics are bound to be a little remote. But Richardson's Pamela and Clarissa, Rousseau's Julie, or the New Heloise, Goethe's Werner, were entirely different. This was rich food for the emotions as well as the intellect. The human mind was like a bird when the cage has been left open. Novels poured from the presses. Byron's Corsair, Scott's Lady of the Lake were romantic novels in verse. The plays of Shakespeare and Dryden and Sheridan could only be seen in the big cities, but these small pocket-sized volumes could penetrate to the remotest corner of the remotest county. It is true, of course, that most people could not read, but that is a minor point. Anyone with enough intelligence to want to read could learn to do so, the children of farm laborers as well as vicars. The creating of other worlds became a major industry in the 19th century. Novelists like Balzac, Hugo, Dickens, Trollope set out to create an actual world as rich and complex as the real world. We take this for granted. We are used to having a choice of alternative worlds from Tolstoy and Flaubert to the latest soap opera on television, and we know that there were literally masterpieces long before Richardson. Chaucer, Malory, Montaigne, Cervantes, Rabelais, Boccaccio. We forget that there were so few of them, and that they were known only to scholars. Life in the 15th century was dull and repetitive for everybody, from the lord of the manor and the local priest to the plowman and the shepherd. There were probably as many imaginative and sensitive people as there are today, at least in proportion to the population, but they had no alternative to letting themselves grow as dull as their surroundings. The only touch of the bizarre or unusual that entered their lives was when a peddler offered a pamphlet containing the confessions of witches, or when the vicar warned them to avoid an old crone who could turn herself into a hare. For 5 centuries or more, the human spirit was starved of an essential vitamin, a vitamin that the Church of the Middle Ages had been able to supply, although in smaller quantities. Man not only possesses a capacity for otherness, for turning away from his own narrowness to the greater world that surrounds him, he possesses a raging appetite for it. I see the witchcraft craze as a direct consequence of this vitamin starvation. When the broad current of romantic culture began to satisfy the appetite, witchcraft suddenly became a thing of the remote past. This conclusion is reinforced by one of the most remarkable novels ever written on the subject of magic and witchcraft, Valery Brusov's Fiery Angel, which Prokofiev turned into his most powerful opera. Brusov was of the Russian symbolist school in the early years of this century, and although he remained in favor after the revolution, his early work was frowned upon. Prokofiev's opera, The Fiery Angel, is still unknown in Russia. The novel tells the story of a soldier, Ruprecht, who returns from South America in the 1530s, at the time when Agrippa and Paracelsus were famous throughout Germany. In a small tavern where he stays overnight, he hears a woman moaning and crying. In the next room he finds a young girl named Renata, who calls him by his name before she collapses in convulsions on the floor, screaming that she is possessed by devils. Ruprecht finally calms her and makes her lie down. She then insists on telling him her story. How at the age of 8, a golden-haired angel, flaming as if with sunshine, came to her nursery and played with her. His name was Madiel. For years they played together, and he told her that she was destined to be a saint, and encouraged her to undertake harsh ascetic exercises. Renata was willing enough to be a saint, but she also wanted to be the bride of Madiel. And one night, after she had made a determined effort to seduce him, he left her. Some time later he appeared to her in a dream and told her to expect to see him again, in human form, in 2 months. And in exactly 2 months a young nobleman named Count Heinrich visited her family. She seduced him, and they eloped to Heinrich's castle on the Danube. But after 2 years' happiness he left without explanation, and had not been back since. Renata had been searching for him ever since, tormented by demons. Ruprecht spends the night lying beside her on the bed in perfect chastity, and the next morning takes her away with him. By this time, of course, he is in love with her, but when he tries to get her into bed, she has hysterics and tells him that she must save herself for Count Heinrich. And Ruprecht, who is by now so enslaved that he agrees to help in the search. The novel turns into a powerful clinical picture of Ruprecht's masochistic relation with Renata. She persuades him to rub himself with a witch's ointment and visit a Sabbath. Brusov's description of the Sabbath is authentic and should be read by anyone who wants to understand what witches were supposed to do on these occasions. The ointment makes him dizzy, and he lies down. Then he finds himself flying through the air on a goat. Half an hour later they land in a valley between 2 hills. He is immediately surrounded by frenzied, naked women. They carry him to the foot of a wooden throne on which the devil is seated. And then we have a lengthy quote here. The seated one was enormous in stature, and made like a human being down to the waist, like a hairy he-goat below. His legs ended in hooves, but his hands were like human hands. So was his face, human, red, sunburnt like an Apache, with large round eyes and a medium beard. He had the appearance of being not more than 40 years old, and there was in his expression something sad and rousing compassion. But this feeling disappeared as soon as one's glance rose above his high forehead to see, emerging distinctly from his curly black hair, 3 horns, the 2 smaller ones behind and the larger one in front, and round the horns was placed a crown, apparently of silver, that emitted a soft glow like the light of the moon. The naked witches placed me before the throne and exclaimed, "Master Leonard, he is new." Then sounded a voice, hoarse and devoid of inflection, as though he who spoke was not accustomed to pronouncing words, but strong and masterful, which addressed me, saying, "Welcome, my son." End quote. Ruprecht has to denounce God, Jesus, and the Virgin, then kiss the devil's hand and his rump. The hand, he notices, has all its digits of equal length, including the thumb, and crooked like a vulture. There follows a dance among huge toads, snakes, and wolves, and then a meal with coarse food and poor wine, at the end of which Ruprecht is drawn into the wood by a young witch and seduced. He wakes up and finds himself on the floor of his room with a sensation like a hangover, but he has not learned the whereabouts of Count Heinrich. The detail of the coarse food and poor wine seems curious. Why should the devil give his servants cheap food, when he is, after all, the prince of the world? Quote unquote. On the other hand, if the Sabbaths really took place as described, the witches themselves would have to provide the food, which would be of poor quality. The devil remains seated and sounds human enough, apart from his enormous stature. Could he be a human being wearing trousers made of goatskin and hooves on his feet? Parts of Bruesov's novel are taken from the actual trial of Sister Maria Renata van Mossau, who was tortured, beheaded, and burned in 1749 near Würzburg. Her confession contains the usual lurid sexual details, more than usual, if anything, so Bruesov was justified in placing so much emphasis on the sexual aspects of the case. The fine seventh chapter of the novel contains an account of Ruprecht's visit to Bonn to see Cornelius Agrippa. There can be no doubt about the authenticity of the material here, and it is interesting to note that Agrippa dismisses magic as childish nonsense, and insists that philosophy and mystical contemplation are of greater importance. By the time he published his occult philosophy, he regarded it as a juvenile work. Back in Cologne, Renata finally allows Ruprecht to possess her, but it is a highly unpleasant night in which she is feverish and insatiable, and obviously thinking about someone else all the time. Bruesov wallows in his hero's masochism. Okay, I'm going to finish this page, and then we're going to call it there, because there's no way I'm going to get through this entire chapter in one night. After this, Renata persuades Ruprecht to challenge Count Heinrich to a duel. He has finally appeared in Cologne. Ruprecht agrees, much against his will, and begins to realize that Renata is not the innocent maiden she makes out. She had seduced Count Heinrich, who was a Rosicrucian and dedicated to chastity, and then persuaded him to practice black magic. He now hates her. No sooner has Ruprecht forced Heinrich to agree to a duel than Renata changes her mind and makes Ruprecht promise not to harm him. The consequence, inevitably, is that Ruprecht is badly wounded, and Renata has to nurse him back to health. After this, she seems cured of her obsession with Heinrich and gives herself to Ruprecht. Then she decides she has to be a saint and leaves him again and goes to a nunnery. Several chapters of the novel are devoted to an encounter between Ruprecht and Dr. Faustus, with Miss Mephistopheles, of course. And at last Ruprecht finds the convent where Renata has taken refuge. The demons have entered her again, and all the nuns are having convulsions. She is arrested by the Archbishop of Trier, and subjected to torture. Eventually she dies in Ruprecht's arms before she can be brought to the stake. Prokofiev makes this scene of the possessed nuns the most hair-raising in the opera. What makes this novel so remarkable is that Bruesov has set out to try to understand what really took place during the witch craze. During the witch craze. Renata is a hysteric driven by sexual craving, but she also knew Ruprecht's name as soon as she saw him. She possesses certain occult powers, but Count Heinrich is certainly not Mediel, the fiery angel, and the whole search is futile. The book is about people who are sucked into the whirlpool of their own fantasies, and whose fantasies take on a strange reality because of the subconscious forces that have been set in motion. For a writer of the pre-Freudian era, the book was published in 1907, it is a remarkably convincing tour de force of abnormal psychology. Being a poet, Brusov had an inkling of the strange truth about witches, that the powers of the human mind are far greater than we understand, and that they can be released by symbols. It is an accident that Master Leonard wears a crown that emits a moony glow. The moon, the white goddess, symbol of the powers that lie below the everyday personality? Question mark. And that is where I'll leave it. That leaves us 20 pages for next time. I believe it does end on 58. No, it ends on 59. So I'm a page off. But it's still a good stopping point because he's finished with that story and he's getting into a new story. So that's a good place. So, my therapist told me the way to achieve the true inner peace is to finish what I start. So far, I've finished 2 bags of M&Ms and a chocolate cake. I feel better. There you go. Finish what you start. I'm going to finish my drink. There we have it. Yep. Okay, so that'll be that for this session. I'm not sure if I'm going to game or not. We'll see here in a few minutes. But I will leave it there. And thank you all for coming in. Thank you, Nambro, for stopping by. And I'll see you in the next one.